The rain had stopped an hour before dawn, leaving the air over the French coast heavy with mist and the cold smell of wet earth. And Lieutenant Marcus Ellery stood alone beside his P-51 Mustang, as if trying to read an omen in the glistening sheen that clung to its silver skin. The ground crews moved around him in tired silence, boots squelching in mud that never seemed to dry, but Marcus hardly noticed. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the very first line of pale rose light was spreading over the distant channel like a wound creeping open. He told himself the same lie he always used before takeoff, that this mission felt like any other, just another escort, just another day in a war filled with days identical to the one before it. But the truth had already sunk its cold fingers into his spine. This mission wasn't routine. The briefing had made that clear enough, and the tension in the older pilots' faces had confirmed it. Today, the bombers would strike the German marshalling yards east of Metz, a region so heavily defended that their commanding officer warned them to expect losses before they'd even reach the primary target. Marcus didn't fear death. He feared the weight of choices he couldn't escape, the ones that sharpened the war into a blade that cut deeper every time he flew. He ran a hand along the Mustang's fuselage, feeling the chill through his glove, trying to ground himself in something solid. Every time he touched the aircraft, he felt as though he were brushing against the edge of his own fate. "Morning ritual?" a voice said behind him. Marcus turned to find his friend, Lieutenant Samuel, Sparrow Keene, standing with that lopsided grin of his, a grin that always looked like defiance against the universe. Sparrow was smaller, wiry, the kind of pilot who made the P-51 dance as if born with wings. "If you don't talk to her, she might not feel appreciated," Marcus replied, forcing a smirk. Sparrow laughed softly and slapped the edge of Marcus's wing. "She'll take care of you. She always does." It was meant to reassure, but Marcus caught the flicker of fatigue in Sparrow's eyes, the shadow that had appeared after the mission 2 weeks ago when they had lost Carter and Holden in a single roaring burst of flak fire. Loss aged everyone in the squadron, even Sparrow, even Marcus, though he tried to hide it beneath duty, silence, and the cold discipline he had mastered since the war began. They climbed into their cockpits, the engines growled awake, and the airfield transformed into a trembling symphony of metal. Marcus loved that moment. The second when the noise became so loud it strangled his thoughts, when he could no longer hear his doubts or fears or the quiet voice telling him that he should have stayed home caring for Anna after her last letter spoke of nights spent alone without sleep. He still kept that letter tucked behind his flight instruments. He never reread it. He was too afraid he'd do something foolish, like ask for leave he knew he couldn't take. The squadron taxied onto the runway, the prop wash flattening the grass, and Marcus pushed the throttle forward until the Mustang lunged ahead. The sudden acceleration pressed him into his seat, and the world blurred past in streaks of gray and green. Then the ground fell away, and the sky opened its arms to swallow him again. The climb eastward carried them above the drifting fog, revealing a sea of clouds stretching toward the heart of occupied Europe. Below, the bombers rallied in formation, their engines beating the air with a steady determination Marcus had always admired. They looked slow compared to the swift Mustangs, but there was a stubborn courage in their lumbering silhouettes, in the way they marched through enemy territory like iron giants daring the world to stop them. Marcus slid into escort position with Sparrow on his wing, and the two exchanged a wordless nod. They had flown together long enough to understand each other without speaking. Their communication was a language made of movement and instinct, perhaps the only language the war had not corrupted. The sun climbed higher, turning the upper clouds into molten gold, and for a while the flight was eerily calm. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always came before combat, the sense that the silence itself was a living creature preparing to lunge. It happened every time, and it never lessened. He scanned the sky constantly, above, below, behind, searching for the glint of metal or the sharp slash of movement that would betray an enemy fighter. The radio hummed with scattered chatter, but the tension beneath every word knotted his stomach. Finally, a warning call burst through the static. "Eagles, be advised. Contacts at high 11 o'clock. Lots of them." The bombers immediately shifted into a defensive pattern, and Marcus angled his Mustang upward, tightening his harness as he squinted toward the distant smear of motion that was rapidly sharpening into dozens of German fighters descending like a dark storm. The first wave hit fast and hard. FW-190s dove straight through the escort screen, guns blazing, their cannons thundering like ruptured heavens. Marcus yanked his Mustang into a steep climb, narrowly avoiding a burst that streaked past his canopy in a line of white-hot light. Sparrow swung underneath him, firing at a fighter diving toward a B-17 in the rear formation. One of Sparrow's deflected rounds detonated on the German's wing root, sending the fighter tumbling downward in a spiral of black smoke. But for every enemy falling, 3 more seemed to appear, carving through the sky in coordinated waves that threatened to tear the escort apart. The Mustang responded beautifully to every control input, rolling and diving with fierce precision, but Marcus could feel the strain building in his arms, the weight of each maneuver compounding the fatigue that lived deep inside his bones. A German fighter latched onto Marcus's tail, its tracers stitching the air just inches from his port wing. He dove sharply and rolled beneath a bomber, feeling the slipstream rattle his canopy as he pulled into a tight turn that brought him behind the FW-190 for the briefest instant. He fired. His guns erupted in a violent shudder, and the rounds tore across the enemy fuselage, punching through the engine cowling. Flames blossomed, and Marcus watched the pilot bail out, the small figure tumbling through the air before a parachute blossomed above him like a pale flower. Marcus exhaled shakily, not sure if he felt relief or guilt. He didn't have time to decide. Another fighter sliced toward him, and he barely dodged, the roar of passing metal filling his ears. The battle raged for endless minutes that felt like distorted fragments of time. Flashes of gunfire, screams over the radio, the thunder of explosions, and the sight of men dying faster than Marcus could process. He saw a bomber lose its wing in a single catastrophic blast. He saw a pilot he recognized, Reynolds, bailing out of his burning P-51 with flames licking at his legs. He saw Sparrow dive too steeply and catch a burst of flak that sent his Mustang shuddering. "Sparrow, pull up!" Marcus yelled, but Sparrow's voice crackled weakly back. "I'm hit. Controls sluggish." His aircraft wobbled dangerously, leaking smoke. Marcus moved to cover him, driving off a fighter that attempted to finish him off, but Sparrow's plane was already descending too fast. "I'll try to make field," Sparrow whispered, breathless and frightened in a way Marcus had never heard before. But the field was far. Too far, they all knew it. "Sparrow, listen to me," Marcus said, his voice suddenly steady, almost calm. "Get her level. Aim for the river." The crash would still be violent, but it was better than nosediving into the hard earth. Sparrow didn't argue. He never argued with Marcus when things grew dire. Marcus watched helplessly as his friend leveled the Mustang with trembling control, then skimmed low over the trees, before striking the river in a turbulent cascade of spray and broken metal. Marcus circled as Sparrow's canopy popped open, and his figure pulled itself into the frigid water. He was alive, barely, but alive. Resistance fighters would find him, Marcus hoped. They had saved down pilots before. Marcus whispered a silent plea to the universe that Sparrow would be one of the lucky ones. But the war didn't give Marcus time to mourn or wait. The bombers were pushing toward their target, and the remaining escorts had to shield them through the last brutal stretch. Marcus rejoined the fight, his grief hardening into something like fire inside him. He no longer flew defensively. He flew with sharp purpose, striking whenever the chance arose, his movements precise and ruthless. His Mustang became an extension of his anger, slicing through enemy formations and driving them back with bursts of fire that felt almost cathartic. By the time the bombers reached Metz, the enemy resistance had thinned, though not without cost. Marcus saw too many empty spaces where Mustangs should have been. The B-17s released their bombs in a synchronized wave, the payloads whistling downward toward the marshalling yards where German military trains churned like arteries feeding the war machine. The explosions that followed were massive, towering pillars of fire and smoke that rose in swirling columns, visible even from miles up. The earth trembled beneath the bombers, and a wave of heat distorted the air around the formation. The target was destroyed, utterly. The return flight felt ghostly. The sky was quieter, but not peaceful. Marcus flew in silence, the cockpit cold around him despite the warmth of the rising afternoon. He kept glancing to his right, expecting to see Sparrow's Mustang sliding into formation with that easy confidence he always wore, but the space remained empty. It stayed empty all the way back to the French coast. It stayed empty as Marcus landed. It stayed empty as he shut down his engine and sat motionless, staring at the puddles shimmering on the tarmac. When the canopy opened, the world felt too bright, too loud, too heavy. Someone clapped a hand on his shoulder, but Marcus didn't turn. He closed his eyes, breathing slowly, letting the wind brush against his face as if it were trying to soothe him. A medic approached with news that a French resistance team had reached the crash site. Sparrow was alive, badly injured, but alive. Marcus felt his knees weaken, a pressure in his throat threatening to break him. Relief washed over him so completely that he had to steady himself against the wing of